Glaubst du an Gespenster?
Was meinst du?
Das Buch, das wir gerade in der Schule lesen. Da geht's um Geister und Dämonen, die man von seinen Eltern erbt. Und dass man es dann weitergibt. Dunkle Sachen. Von Generation zu Generation.
If you were to ask me whether the hit Netflix series Dark is a quote, bingeable show, I would answer that with a very hesitant yes, but only if you are in the mood for some serious mental Pilates. Don't get me wrong, for a time travel story as complex and intricate as this one, you ideally should be watching the episodes within quick succession of each other. But I'd be lying if I said binging episodes 7 through 10 of Season 1 didn't leave my head thoroughly spinning as I began hastily adding to my Canva-made family trees. And I've only just watched the first season. If I'm making the series sound like an overly complicated, high-concept science fiction show that ends up being homework for the viewer, well, that's because it is. Okay, no, not really, but you do need to be paying attention, and I promise, if you watch the show with a basic understanding of the main characters and their families, you should be fine. Just remember to give yourself some breathing room to process. Dark, in all honesty, is some of the best science fiction I have ever seen. And its use of the concept of time travel, how it affects the characters, and the larger philosophical implications it proposes is nothing short of genius. Granted, I am not the most knowledgeable when it comes to science fiction and media, but I have a feeling that Dark will definitely be looked at as one of the greats in years to come. It's a series that constantly keeps you guessing, revealing new information in subtle and clever ways that builds off of or completely alters what you thought you already knew. And while there is a lot to recommend the series, such as its ambitious story structure, atmospheric visuals, and great performances, what I want to talk about is the series' cultural implications as it relates to its German setting. Watching the series, I found myself wondering more and more about how a story's genre provides new layers of meaning when examined through the cultures in which they were produced. For Dark, I want to examine what the show's time travel narrative in a small German town reveals about Germany's relationship with the concepts of time, memory, and collective guilt. Dark originated as a series between writing-directing partners Barenboe Odar and Janke Friese. Coming off of the success of Odar's and Friese's 2014 hacker thriller Who Am I?, Netflix approached the duo about adapting the film for a series. According to Odar, however, with the recent release of USA's series Mr. Robot, they were reluctant to proceed with a television series due to the similarities. Instead, Odar and Friese combed through other story pitches they had until eventually coming upon two, one focusing on the disappearance of a child in a small town, and the other on a time travel story. They decided to combine the two stories and approached Netflix with their pitch for Dark. The series was approved in early 2016, with principal photography beginning later that year. Dark came off of a recent Netflix trend of releasing international series such as Subura, Blood on Rome, and Narcos, with promotion for the series emphasizing that it was Netflix's first German-language production. And, quick aside, I know reading subtitles isn't for everyone, but I really recommend you give it a try in German because the English dub is truly a thing to behold.
How did people feel the first time that they were told the Earth was really round? Yes, it's totally insane. What if it isn't?
The German setting, combined with some surface-level similarities to Stranger Things, such as a missing young boy, a small town, and ominous government facilities on the horizon, led to the series initially being dubbed as the German Stranger Things, although anyone who watches the first few episodes will most likely be quickly dispelled of that belief. The story is set in Winden, a small German town that has been plagued with tragedy. The first season follows 4 families, with the Kahnwald and Nielsen families being the 2 families of focus, and the Tiedemans and Dopplers being the supporting. The first episode begins with the main character, Jonas Kahnwald's father, Michael Kahnwald, killing himself after leaving behind a note with instructions for it to be read on November 19th at 10:13 p.m. Months later, Jonas is still reeling from his father's death as the town of Winden deals with the recent disappearance of teenager Eric Obendorf. On the case is police chief Charlotte Doppler and officer Ulrich Nielsen, the husband of school principal Katarina and father of Martha, Magnus, and Mikkel. Martha is dating hotel owner Regina Tiedemann's son Bartosz, although it is clear that she and Jonas still harbor romantic feelings after a summer fling. When the children of these families take a late-night trip to the Winden caves in search of weed supposedly stashed somewhere, Mikkel goes missing without a trace. The season proceeds to follow these families and their various connections with one another alongside the search for Mikkel, unfolding at a gradual pace and keeping its cards close to its chest as it builds its intricate story and increasing cast of characters. The time travel is introduced early on, with its implications and effects taking on more significance as it is revealed there's a wormhole in the Vinden caves that leads to 3 different time periods. It also provides a jumping-off point for Dark's thematic focus on families, intergenerational trauma, and guilt, something that Germany, historically, is no stranger to. In 1945, Austrian psychoanalyst Carl Jung's essay After the Catastrophe explored the psychological concept of collective guilt, or Kollektivschuld, through the recent aftermath of World War II and the German population's role in the war and atrocities such as the Holocaust. In his essay, Jung states, "If a German is prepared to acknowledge his moral inferiority before the whole world without attempting to minimize it or explain it away with flimsy arguments, then he will stand a reasonable chance, after a time, of being mistaken for a more or less decent man and will thus be absolved of his collective guilt." While the concept of an individual inheriting the injustices committed by their ancestors can be traced all the way back to the Old Testament, the term collective guilt from a sociological perspective refers specifically to how an individual's memory and perception is influenced by their community, and the responsibility the individual can feel for said community's actions. When referring to how an individual is shaped by these societal forces, Joanna Barbara Polak, in her essay Our Sins of Past Generations Inherited, states, "Social frameworks are based on history and collective memory. That is how the collective guilt and responsibility are maintained, actively and consciously, or passively and unconsciously." If you want a more in-depth look at the collective's influence on the individual and memory as it pertains to Germany during World War II, then I strongly suggest you watch Implicitly Pretentious, The Sociology of Jojo Rabbit, and Lady Night the Brave's Remembering with a Twist, a Jojo Rabbit and the Book Thief video essay. They're great. With the concept of German collective guilt in the general discourse in the aftermath of World War II, bolstered by US and British campaigns against the German public, Germany began the process of denazification with the goal of rejoining Europe and moving forward. With the aim of forgetting and deflecting responsibility, the general attitude during the era of the German Federal Republic in the 1950s tended to portray the German people as kindred victims of the regime and the war going the way it did because of a few bad apples. With the publicity of the Nuremberg trials in the early 1960s, however, and teachers within the education system bringing to light new findings about Germany's role in the war, historical erasure was no longer an option as Germans began to acknowledge their collective guilt throughout the 60s and 70s, a term called... I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce this.
Vergangenheitsbewältigung.
This desire to come to terms with a painful legacy produced intense intergenerational conflict, which went on to significantly impact German filmmaking. In 1962, a group of young liberal filmmakers from West Germany signed the Oberhausen Manifesto, which signified the beginning of New German cinema, a movement focused both on the contemporary issues of Germany's present and the haunting legacy of its past. Spearheaded by young filmmakers such as Rainier Werner Fassbinder, Werner Herzog, and Marguerite von Trotta, they sought to eschew conventional filmmaking and storytelling by addressing current socio-political issues in Germany. They also explored their own complicated relationship with Germany's past and their parents' generation's complicity in it. According to Anton Kaes in Hitler to Heimat, The Return of History as Film, for many years during the 1950s and early 1960s, no one dared to ask their parents what they did during the war, how they lived under Hitler, and to what extent they collaborated with the regime, unwittingly or not. Not until the late 70s did writers and filmmakers willingly take part in what Freud described as the process of remembering, repeating, and working through. This process can be seen in new German films such as The Tin Drummer and Germany Pale Mother, both of which explore Germany during the Nazi regime as seen through the eyes of children and women. This generational exploration of the past through memory and reconstruction marked a significant shift in Germany's own depiction and reconciliation with its history as depicted through its art, a process which would go on to influence both aesthetically and thematically books, films, and television. If the processing of collective guilt by exploring the past and memory has been a theme in Germany's literature and films within the past few decades, then Dark offers a unique spin on that by exploring these concepts through the one thing that has produced them, time, and the one thing that can make it malleable, time travel. While the show makes no direct references or depictions of Germany's history as it pertains to World War II and the Nazi Party, the historical influence of these events on the German psyche is apparent when looking into how it shaped the darker aspects of the series. When discussing the show's sinister elements, series writer and creator Friese stated that, "We feel delving into those dark themes had a lot to do with who we are and what happened in the first years of the last century, when basically there were 2 world wars and lots of people killed in the name of Germans. It's something that we as the younger generation talked about extensively in school, and always with the question, how could this happen? How can people actually do such dark and creepy things?" I think those themes, the darkness in human behavior itself, is something that is very German. This darkness is prevalent throughout the series, both aesthetically and narratively, and while this prevailing theme can be a little insistent at times,
Da draußen ist nur Chaos. Vergiss das nicht. Auch wenn manches, was wir tun, von dunkler Natur ist. Dein Schmerz hat dich gemacht, Helge. Schmerz und Chaos.
the show does do an excellent job of portraying the character's guilt and trauma, especially in how it pertains to its effect on younger generations. We see this in the similarities of Mikkel's disappearance as it relates to Mads, a family tragedy repeating itself with almost identical factors, but also more broadly in how characters face and come to terms with the past sins or secrets of their own parents.
Habt ihr das gesehen? Das ist eure Mutter wirklich. Erzähl ihnen von damals. Sag ihnen, wie ihre Mutter wirklich ist.
Glaubst du, es wird jemals wieder so sein wie vorher? Weißt du, was ich komisch finde?
Whether it be Jonas's need for closure over his father's suicide, Franziska's transparent acknowledgement of her parents' separation, or Magnus and Martha feeling like their family is disintegrating around them in the aftermath of their brother's disappearance, these young characters are left spinning in the wake of personal tragedies. Feelings of any security they once had from their families gone when faced with the unknowability of their own parents. These feelings of disequilibrium are personified by the town of Winden itself.
Wir sind sozusagen immer ein bisschen aus der Taktung. Als ich klein war, hatte ich immer das Gefühl, dass mit Winden irgendwas nicht stimmt.
This is where I think the use of time travel becomes so effective when looking at it through Germany's history of exploring collective guilt through its media. If films during the German New Wave of the 70s and 80s were the results of a new generation remembering, reconstructing, and processing the past through their work, then in a meta sense, Dark tasks its characters to do the same within the show's own universe. Ulrich and Jonas are constantly piecing together and learning new information about their families in the town of Winden, attempting to use these findings to mentally rebuild the past and hopefully change it for the better. And while earlier German cinema showed filmmakers using this kind of reconstruction to examine their own relationship with guilt during the time they were not even born, in Dark, a character's existence, or lack thereof, is no longer a factor when it comes to their ability to inhabit and even alter the past, directly or indirectly. But if time travel narratives have taught us anything, it's that some things cannot be changed and our control can be more limited than initially thought.
Wir sind nicht frei in dem, was wir tun, weil wir nicht frei sind in dem, was wir wollen. Wir kommen nicht an gegen das, was tief in uns ist.
Just as Germans born after World War II would have to reconcile their own identity with their nation's history, a reality they had no control over but still felt responsibility for, Dark similarly shows the fear and horror that can come with the awareness over the lack of freedom one has to alter a painful narrative, even with time travel.